Why did an entire continent appear on maps the moment Tartaria disappeared? I want to start with a summer that never came. In 1816, farmers across New England planted their crops in the usual way, expecting the usual season. What they got instead was snow in June, not a light frost, not an unusual cold snap that passed in a few days. Snow. In June. Crops that had been in the ground for weeks froze and died. Across Europe, the harvest failed. In Ireland, a famine began. In France, bread riots broke out in cities that had only recently survived revolution. Across the Northern Hemisphere, from Vermont to Germany to China, something had gone wrong with the sky. The sun still rose, but it gave less warmth than it should have. The light had a strange quality to it, dimmer, filtered, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. Witnesses described sunsets of extraordinary color, deep reds and purples bleeding across the horizon long after the sun had gone down. And then the cold came again, night after night, through what should have been the warmest months of the year. The official explanation is the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in April 1815. It was one of the largest volcanic explosions in recorded history. The blast sent an estimated 100 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. Ash and sulfur spread around the planet in the upper layers of the sky, partially blocking solar radiation for months. Scientists call the result volcanic winter. Historians call 1816 the year without a summer. It is a clean, documented, widely accepted explanation. And I'm not here to challenge it, but here is where I need you to pay close attention. Because Mount Tambora explains the cold. It explains the failed harvests. It explains the migration of populations who could no longer feed themselves where they had always lived. What it does not explain, what nobody seems to think requires an explanation at all, is what happened to the map of the world in the years immediately following that catastrophic disruption. Because in the decade between 1815 and 1825, two things happened simultaneously that have never been placed next to each other and examined with the same set of eyes. One was the appearance of an entirely new continent on the official map of the world. The other was the beginning of the end for one of the largest territorial designations that map had ever carried. And once you place those two events side by side, the official timeline begins to feel like it is hiding something. Let me take you back further first, because the context matters. For roughly 3 centuries, from the 1500s through the late 1700s, European maps showed a vast territory stretching across the interior of northern Asia, labeled with some variation of the same word. Tartary, sometimes Tartaria, sometimes Grand Tartary, or Great Tartary, or Independent Tartary, or Chinese Tartary. The specific labeling varied by country and cartographer, but the presence of the name did not. It appeared on Dutch maps, French maps, British maps, Russian maps, German maps. It appeared in the Encyclopedia Britannica. It appeared in geographic dictionaries and travel accounts and imperial correspondence. For 300 years, Tartary was as real a place on the European map as France or Persia or the Ottoman Empire. This raises a simple but critical question. What was it? The official historical answer, the one you will find in any reputable academic source today, is that Tartary was never a real political entity. It was a loose geographical label, a catch-all term used by Western cartographers for the vast, poorly understood interior of Asia. As geographic knowledge improved, the label became obsolete and was replaced by more precise designations. The Russian Empire expanded, the Qing dynasty consolidated its territories, and the word Tartary simply faded, the way outdated terminology always fades, gradually, naturally, without controversy. That explanation is neat, it is tidy, and it collapses entirely when you look at the actual maps. Because the maps of Tartary are not vague, they are not the cartographic equivalent of a question mark drawn over an unknown region. They show borders, they show cities, they show subdivisions, political structures, trade routes. The cartographers who drew these maps were sophisticated professionals whose reputations depended on accuracy. These were not decorative flourishes. These were not placeholder labels for a blank the mapmaker didn't know how to fill. These were maps of something that, over the course of roughly 50 years in the early to middle 19th century, disappeared not just from cartographic convention, but from encyclopedias, from historical records, from the collective memory of every literate civilization on Earth simultaneously, not gradually, not with the slow erosion of a term that simply falls out of fashion, simultaneously, across competing nations, competing languages, competing publishing houses that had no particular reason to agree on anything, all of them arriving at the same editorial conclusion within the same compressed historical window. Tartary was nothing. Tartary was never important. Move along. The silence was deafening. Now, hold that in your mind. Hold the image of this vast labeled territory, 3 centuries of maps suddenly going quiet, and then turn the globe upside down. Because while Tartary was disappearing from the top of the world, something was appearing at the bottom. In 1820, 3 separate expeditions reported seeing Antarctica within the same year. A Russian expedition led by Fabian von Bellingshausen, a British expedition led by Edward Bransfield, an American sealer named Nathaniel Palmer. Different ships, different nations, different routes through the Southern Ocean, all of them encountering the same landmass within months of each other, as if the continent had been waiting just beyond the horizon for the moment when it was finally time to be found. The official history presents this as coincidence. Maritime technology had improved. Ships could now navigate farther south than before. Multiple expeditions were operating in the region for reasons of commerce and exploration, and the circumstance of simultaneous discovery was simply the natural result of simultaneous effort. Fine, I understand that argument. I'm not here to dismiss the courage or the skill of the men who sailed those waters. But I want to sit with something for a moment. I want to sit with the timeline itself. In 1816, the sky over the northern hemisphere went dark and cold. Populations moved. Civilizations were disrupted. In the years following that disruption, the largest single territorial designation on the map of the known world began to be quietly erased from the cartographic record. And at almost exactly the same moment, an entirely new continent appeared. Not a coastline, not an island chain. A continent, a landmass larger than Europe, introduced to the official record of the world within the same narrow historical window when another vast territory was being removed from it. Ask yourself what you would do if you were redrawing the map of the world and you needed to account for something that no longer fit. Ask yourself what function a blank space at the bottom of the globe might serve in a moment when blank spaces elsewhere were becoming politically inconvenient. Ask yourself who benefits when the world's attention is turned toward a continent of ice and cold, and almost total inaccessibility, at precisely the moment when questions about what was in the interior of Asia might otherwise be becoming very difficult to answer. I'm not claiming a conspiracy. I'm asking you to notice a pattern. Here is what deepens that pattern into something I find genuinely difficult to dismiss. There are maps that predate 1820 which appear to show Antarctica, not the ice sheet as it looks today, but something in the far south. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral who stated he compiled it from older source charts, contains a southern landmass that some researchers have argued corresponds to the Antarctic coastline beneath its ice. Historians are divided on this. Some believe the shape represents a distorted extension of South America. Others believe the admiral was working from Mediterranean sources that themselves derived from even older geographic traditions. The question remains genuinely open. In 1531, a French cartographer named Oronce Finet produced a world map showing a large southern continent with rivers and mountains drawn across it. Not an outline, a landscape, interior geography. The kind of detail you do not include if you are simply speculating about the theoretical need for landmass in the southern hemisphere to balance the globe. You include that kind of detail if someone has told you something, or if something was once known. The official explanation for these maps is that they represent Terra or Australis, a purely theoretical continent that early cartographers imagined must exist to counterbalance the weight of the northern landmasses. Intellectual speculation translated into cartographic form. And perhaps that is all it was. But here is what troubles me. If the southern continent was theoretical, if it was simply a philosophical construct drawn into the blank space below the known world, then why did it disappear from those maps during the exact centuries when Tartary was most prominently labeled across the north? And why did a real continent then appear in the official record at the precise moment when that northern territory was beginning its systematic removal from the cartographic archive? The deeper I went into this, the more the two stories stopped feeling like separate mysteries. Think about what cartography actually is. A map is not a neutral document. A map is an argument. It is a claim about what exists, what matters, what deserves to be named and located and given weight in the minds of anyone who reads it. When you add something to a map, you are asserting that it is real and that it counts. When you remove something from a map, you are asserting the opposite. And when you do both at the same time, when you remove one thing and add another within the same historical moment, you are making two arguments simultaneously. You are saying this no longer exists, and you are saying, look here instead. That is not scholarship. That is editorial control. And editorial control at the scale we are looking at, coordinated across nations that were otherwise rivals, expressed across every major reference work and atlas and encyclopedia of the era, does not happen by accident. It does not emerge organically from the natural evolution of geographic knowledge. It requires infrastructure. It requires aligned institutions. It requires a shared understanding among the people making these decisions of what the map of the world is supposed to say. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Now consider what Antarctica actually offered to the 19th century world. It was real enough to be undeniable. Explorers had seen it. The ice was there. You could sail toward it and photograph it. But it was also almost perfectly inaccessible. You could not live there. You could not trade there. You could not build cities or establish archives or develop the kind of continuous human presence that generates documentary records and contradictory accounts and the messy, complicated, verifiable history of a place that people actually inhabit. Antarctica was a continent you could point to without ever having to explain it, without anyone ever being able to challenge your explanation. It arrived in the historical record already sealed under miles of ice. Whatever was underneath that ice, whatever geology or landscape or evidence of an earlier world might be buried there, was protected from investigation by the sheer physical impossibility of reaching it. And here is the strangest part. That protection has held. It continues to hold. We have modern satellites. We have radar capable of penetrating ice sheets. We have research stations that have operated continuously for decades. And scientists will tell you plainly that large portions of the Antarctic landscape beneath the ice remain poorly understood, that the subglacial terrain is still being mapped, that the geological and climatic history of that buried landscape is still being pieced together from fragments. A century and a half of modern exploration in Antarctica still has not fully given up what lies beneath it. Whatever the cartographers of the early 19th century placed at the bottom of the world, they placed something that would not easily be opened. I keep returning to the years between 1816 and 1825. The sky goes dark over the northern hemisphere. The year without a summer sends populations moving across Europe and North America, disrupting the agricultural systems that entire civilizations depend on. In the chaos and displacement that follows, the largest territorial designation on the map of Asia begins its quiet disappearance, and a continent appears in the south. Not because it was built, not because it was invented, but because it was introduced, placed into the official record at the exact moment when the official record needed a new blank space, when the powerful institutions of the era needed somewhere to point that was real enough to be credible and remote enough to be unverifiable. A continent of ice at the bottom of the world, discovered simultaneously by 3 expeditions from 3 different nations, in a year when the map of the known world was being comprehensively redrawn. The official explanation asks us to believe this was all coincidence. Different cartographers, different encyclopedias, different governments, all independently arriving at the same conclusions about Tartary and Antarctica within the same narrow window of historical time. Each institution simply updating its records based on better information. Each expedition simply happening to arrive in the same ocean, in the same year, through nothing more than the ordinary momentum of the age of exploration. I cannot prove otherwise. I want to be honest about that. What I can do is show you the shape of what I found when I looked. A 300-year presence on the map erased without documentation, without transition, without the kind of messy historical record that the decline of any significant territory leaves behind. And rising to meet that disappearance from the other side of the world, a new continent introduced at a moment of global disruption, sealed under ice, governed almost immediately by international treaty, protected from independent investigation by geography and logistics and the sheer physical hostility of the environment surrounding it. The map changed in both directions at once. Something left and something arrived. And the institutions that made both decisions appear to have agreed without ever discussing it publicly, without leaving records of their coordination, without ever providing an explanation for why these two events, which have never been placed next to each other in any official history, happened within the same generation. Maybe that is coincidence. Maybe it is the ordinary machinery of how knowledge evolves, and how maps change, and how empires reorganize the world they inherit. Maybe Tartaria really was just a label, and Antarctica really was just an undiscovered continent waiting for the right ships to arrive. But I cannot stop thinking about the farmers in New England watching their crops die in June, about the skies that went dark across 2 continents, about the millions of people who moved through that disrupted world without understanding what had changed or why. And I cannot stop thinking about the cartographers working in the years immediately after, deciding with extraordinary coordination and extraordinary speed what the world would look like when the smoke finally cleared. What did they know that they weren't putting on the map? What did they put on the map that was never meant to be, examined too closely? And what was buried, not under ice, but under the weight of 3 centuries of official silence in the interior of a continent that history decided, quietly and permanently, was nothing worth investigating? The map is still there. Antarctica is still there. And somewhere beneath the ice and beneath the silence, the question waits. Not for a better expedition, not for more advanced radar or deeper drilling or a warmer season. It waits for someone willing to look at both ends of the map at the same time and ask why they changed together. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it.